One of the themes that runs through anomalistic psychology is that of cognitive biases. Now, we have absolutely amazing cognitive systems. We take them very much for granted, but they really are incredible. The things that you do every second of every day of your waking life, we still, as yet, don't have computers that can do that stuff. I mean, it'll come. The computers will get cleverer and cleverer, but at the moment, there's still a lot of stuff just in terms of kind of instant facial recognition, and it's the whole package, all of those things that we can do, language, face recognition, depth perception, all that. We're just doing it all the time, we're just like that, we don't even think about it. Now, what we do know is, that having said how wonderful the cognitive system is, there are certain systematic biases that we are all susceptible to. So there are certain kinds of, on certain conditions, we will misperceive, we will misremember, we will misjudge. And it's possible that some of these cognitive biases might explain why sometimes we think we've experienced something paranormal, when maybe there are alternative explanations. And so there's been a lot of research along those lines. Now, it's pretty widely accepted these days that there are kind of two distinct modes of thought that we can engage in. On the one hand, we have what's been referred to as System 1 thinking, which is basically, it's based on heuristics, rules of thumb, quick and dirty forms of processing that usually lead to the right answer. So it would be this form of thinking is very, it's non-conscious, it's automatic, it's very quick, it's kind of often based on emotion and so on and so forth. And in contrast to that, we have System 2 thinking, which is slower, more deliberative, we're consciously aware of that. It's like kind of when you're trying to solve a problem and you're thinking hard about it, reflective and so on. Now, a lot of decision making, we might feel it's based on System 2 thinking, but the evidence shows that actually it's based on System 1 thinking. And this kind of our first impressions, our first instincts about something, we can rationalise them in a plausible sounding way, but we are doing that. We're very often influenced by factors that we're not consciously aware of. People have looked at kind of cognitive biases in a whole range of different areas. Some of these seem to be particularly relevant to ostensibly paranormal experiences or reasoning about the paranormal. In fact, reasoning is a good example. We're not very good at reasoning. We're not very good at probabilistic reasoning when it comes to making judgments about likely probabilities in everyday life. And also when it comes to things like kind of syllogistic reasoning and so on. But again, we are pretty poor at these things. There's some evidence to suggest that people who believe in the paranormal, we're all bad, but they tend to be a little bit worse than the non-believers. Now, you can to some extent try to overcome these biases by doing things like critical thinking courses, or better still, anomalistic psychology. But you cannot entirely overcome them. You just won't. It's part of being human. One of the interesting questions that arises is, well, why have we got these biases? Why haven't through evolution that we've now got cognitive systems that don't have these biases? Well, the answer to that is probably that in evolutionary terms, it's a cost-benefit analysis. Everybody always uses the same example, so I will as well. The kind of Stone Age man standing there in front of the bush and there's something rustling in the bushes. Now, is it a saber-toothed tiger or is it just the wind? The guy who relies on the quick and dirty heuristics and immediately comes to the decision, it's a tiger, and gets the hell out of there, is not going to pay a great price for being wrong. He thought it was a tiger and it wasn't. Somebody who kind of goes for the more, I wonder, is it a tiger? I'm not sure. Let's weigh up the evidence. If he's wrong, if he's either too slow to make a decision or he decides that there isn't a tiger when there is, he's lunch. So evolution has favoured this quick and dirty decision making that is usually right over a more deliberative, slower process that is right slightly more often. So evolution has favoured the quick and dirty System 1 thinking over the slower System 2 thinking. It makes more sense that we make quick decisions based on imperfect evidence, maybe, but usually that'll lead to the right conclusion rather than the slower, more deliberate decision making that's right slightly more often. When it comes to considering whether evolutionary processes are still at work, I think the answer has to be, well, yes, they probably are. But what's happened is that we now live in a much more advanced technological society, and so it strikes me as being more likely that the really interesting evolution is not taking place at the biological level anymore, it's at the technological level. And this can kind of throw up some interesting circumstances, because we, in terms of the kind of physical structures of our brains, we're not that different to the Stone Age man, so as humans that we've evolved from. But we're living in an age now where, thanks to technology, we can do all kinds of things that were never dreamt of. But we do still have this interesting thing that, despite the Enlightenment, religious beliefs are still very prevalent. People believe in superstition, people believe in magic. And I think the reason why is because it is the way our brains are wired. And we can't get away from that. And in a way, maybe we shouldn't even try. I mean, I'm actually, on the one hand, quite a fan of the irrational side of our nature. I love things like surrealism and science fiction, imagining other worlds and blah, blah, blah. The roots of creativity, I think, very often come from that irrational side of our nature, and I would hate to see it disappear. But it can be a problem. As in evolutionary terms, I think biological evolution it's just there. It's just going to be going on all the time. But the idea that thanks to technology that other factors are at play. And then and if we get into the whole area of mimetics, then the idea that it's memes that are evolving now. I mean, that's a very interesting idea in terms of, is it really a scientific theory or is it just an interesting idea? And I don't know. I'm fascinated with the idea, but short answer is yes. Biological evolution is still carrying on, but there may be other factors that are now much more important in determining our future. I think there are lots of areas in life where we can and should do our best to make very, very rational decisions. So if we're talking about areas like health or finances and other kind of decisions of that kind, it probably is best not to go with your intuitions and your instincts, but to try and coolly and calmly lay out all the pros and all the cons of particular decisions that you might make, and so on. And to some extent we can do that. There are tools and techniques to help people to do that. We typically don't. And of course what we're very good at is making the decision and then justifying it. And we do that all the time. But we can try to make decisions in other ways. I mean, there are certain other areas where, as far as I'm concerned, you can't really bring those kinds of approaches to bear. I mean, for me, I very much go along with those philosophers who argue that you can't deduce moral values from from empirical evidence. You can't get to an ought statement from an is statement. Now that doesn't mean, a lot of people mistakenly kind of argue therefore that skeptics and atheists and rationalists have no morality. Well, that's clearly not true. I mean, these people are very often, passionate about various social issues, and and I put myself in that category. There are a lot of things that I will sometimes have an attitude of, I just know that's wrong, and I will campaign against it. But if you were to ask me to, okay, now logically justify why you think that's wrong, you could probably tie me up in knots. There's just certain issues certain values that I passionately believe in, and I can't really go beyond that other than to say, well, I believe in freedom of speech, I believe in equality, I'm a supporter of gay rights, etc., etc. Certain things you just think, that's the way that things should be, and that's not the way things should be. But in other areas you can bring the evidence to bear, and in particular when you've got situations where claims are being made that can be put to the test. If it's testable, let's test it. If it's not testable, well, okay, if you choose to believe that there's an omnipotent God that made the universe and is all-knowing and all-benevolent and blah, 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 there's not going to be any logical argument that I can put forward that's going to dissuade you from that, even though I don't share that view myself. But there are certain other areas. If you say, I've got healing powers, I can heal people, well, okay, prove it, we can test that, So yeah, I don't think science has all the answers, but on some issues it definitely does have the best answers. I certainly think you can bring scientific findings and empirical evidence to bear when you're trying to make decisions about moral and ethical issues, because sometimes those arguments are based upon certain claims. The idea that animals don't feel pain, well, that's something that in one sense we can never know subjectively what's going on in another being's mind, be they animal or human, but we can draw certain conclusions to a certain degree of kind of subjective reasonableness, and sometimes those decisions can be informed by scientific studies that look at the kind of ways that animals react under stressful situations, blah blah blah. So it's not to say that you can never bring any of this evidence to bear on scientific on moral issues, and even the question of whether morality itself can sometimes be studied in a scientific way. I think there's some really interesting work going on about children's understanding of morality and how that understanding develops and becomes more sophisticated and so on. And that's all perfectly good scientific research. But I suppose really what I'm saying is that for me, it's not plausible that just by having an understanding of the scientific method that somehow spontaneously moral and ethical values just emerge from that. I don't buy that idea, I would hope that I would be able to kind of produce more evidence in favour of why I feel something this is the right thing to do and this is the wrong thing to do. I would bring evidence to bear on that. If people are claiming that typically people don't just base their arguments on some kind of, it's because it feels right to me. They typically have other arguments about the consequences of not behaving this way, and this is, blah, blah, blah. And then you can kind of, let's test that. Is it really the case that, the more sex education we have in our schools, the more teenage pregnancies we'll get? Well, actually, no, you can look at the empirical evidence, it's not true. Does capital punishment actually reduce homicide levels and so on? These are empirical questions that you can look at the evidence and they can inform the debate. But the ultimately you will get down to the level of these core values that I think very often you just say, well, I believe in that because I just think it's the right thing to do, it's the right value to hold. Well, I wouldn't claim to be an expert on Bayes' theorem, but I am familiar with it in general terms and the ways in which it differs from the more standard statistical techniques. And essentially what's happening with Bayes' theorem is you are taking account of both the results of your latest experiment but also the prior probabilities. So how likely, if you've got a claim essentially which is on the basis of prior probabilities extremely unlikely to be true, then any evidence from any one individual experiment that appears to support that unlikely hypothesis has got to be kind of much stronger in order for you to conclude that this hypothesis is probably true. Now, I can see the logic and the sense in it, but the problem that I have with it is that people are going to differ, particularly in the areas I'm interested in terms of what they think are reasonable values for those prior probabilities. If we take Dean Radin and Rupert Sheldrake on the one hand, and we take James Randi on the other, they're going to have very, very, very different estimates for those prior probabilities. They're going to be, obviously Randi would say that it's almost infinitely unlikely that telepathy is real, and Radin and Sheldrake will take the position that it's very, very, very likely that telepathy is real. And so I don't really see that in those kind of contexts it really helps us to resolve the issue. You're just in the end going back to, trying to decide it in other ways, and the things that would really convince me would be a single replicable robust phenomenon. If we had that, just one paranormal effect that we could use as the basis for a first year lab class, that would be enough for me, or a piece of technology that was based on the operation of paranormal forces, and it may seem a very naive conception of proof. There is also this other thing that's always struck me is, why is it that I'm much more convinced by the results of my own experiments than by other people's? Because in one sense I shouldn't be, it's all kind of evidence, but I am. If I can't get any effect in my own experiments, even if there's a dozen other people who say that they've got this effect, I'll probably be a bit dubious about whether it's a real effect or not. I would not claim to be an expert in terms of futurology by any stretch of the imagination. I suppose in terms of how we might try and judge what aspects of technological development might have a big impact in the future, I'd probably limit myself to just a couple of comments. I think one is that I think we are now living in the age of kind of big science, in the sense that there are not going to be that many massive, tremendous breakthroughs that are the results of an individual scientist working on their own. I think those days are gone. And so it will be people working on massive projects like the Human Genome Project, etc., and it'll be a slow, incremental increase in terms of knowledge and understanding and actual application. I suppose the second point I'd want to make would be that we almost certainly will not be able to make good predictions about where the really important advances are going to be made. I'm just thinking in terms of the predictions that were made for how many computers we would ultimately need, and I think there's a famous, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but some prediction from, I think it was IBM, saying, ultimately we might need as many as 10, and you look back now and think, whoa, the internet, I suspect, maybe some real visionaries saw the potential in the early days, but I suspect that most people didn't. It's just one of those things that's evolved and now is such an integral part of our way of life that we couldn't survive without it. But it wasn't that it was a kind of planned, something that happened in a planned way. So I suspect there may well be more developments of that kind that by their very nature are just unforeseeable. So I guess I'm not going to kind of stick my neck out here. Maybe if these people who claim that you could use paranormal forces to actually operate technology, if that ever turned out to be true, that might be one of those kind of game-changing developments. But I'm not going to bet on that one anyway. So, I suppose there are areas where I think we can be very hopeful that nanotechnology being one example, developments in AI and so on, I suspect that they will have a huge impact. But we will see. You can also look back to the kind of 70s and 80s and people making kind of predictions that by now robots would be keeping us as pets. And of course, it's not happened. So, I love those old Tomorrow's World programs where, by now we should all be kind of wearing silver suits and flying around with jetpacks and so on, and it ain't happened. But other things that we didn't see coming have completely transformed our lives. So we'll wait and see. In terms of the challenges that I think face contemporary skepticism, then I think the main challenge is probably just to get the message out there. I think that I think there have been very good developments in recent years with respect to that. And again, I'm more familiar with the UK scene than I am in the situation in Australia. But there's been a kind of definite grassroots skeptical movement. I think it's kind of most clearly epitomised with the success of the Skeptics in the Pub meetings. I mean, there are now there must be around about 50 branches of Skeptics in the Pub up and down the UK now, and each of these branches holds monthly meetings where the speaker comes in and does a talk and there's a Q&A. And there are other meetings and conferences that go on top of that, and there are podcasts, and there's the Skeptic magazine, and there's a lot of stuff going on. There are also a number of kind of high-profile celebrity skeptics. So we've got, there are various kind of people on the science side, Brian Cox, Ben Goldacre, Richard Wiseman, people like this. But we've also got, there's a lot of comedians who are very openly skeptical. You've got Tim Minchin, Dara O'Brien, Robin Ince, all these kinds of people, and it's kind of getting the message out there. There's definitely a feeling now that you don't need to be quiet about your skepticism and atheism. You can actually voice it without feeling that you are behaving in a socially unacceptable manner. And I mean, I think that's a very, very hopeful sign. I think ultimately, for me anyway, skepticism is not actually about trying to convince everybody that you're wrong to hold these beliefs and this is the way you should be thinking and so on and so forth. It's a matter of, in terms of kind of consumer education, if you like. It's about putting the information out there that homeopathy is bullshit and giving the reasons as to why it's bullshit and telling people. And then at the end of the day, if you want to still spend your money on useless sugar pills that can't work over and above a placebo effect and have been shown not to work over and above a placebo effect, that's your decision. I'm not going to try and ban it. You can do that, but you've at least you've been exposed to the information. You make the choice. But I think it's important that we try to get across to people that there is a need for critical thinking, that it can protect them from making some very dangerous decisions. On the other hand, as I've kind of hopefully made clear in some of the things I've said, there are times when magical thinking, paranormal beliefs, superstition, religion can actually serve useful psychological functions for people. So many different examples of that. Now, with a scientist's hat on, scientists are interested in the way the universe is. We're not going to believe things just because it makes us feel good. But most people are not scientists, and they are going to believe in a lot of things because they find those beliefs comforting. And I'm not really that bothered about, I'm not intent on trying to rip those beliefs away from people, but with the scientist's hat on, if you ask me what I think about the way things are, I'll tell you. At the end of the day, science is about truth. It's not about believing things just because they make us feel good.